he'd be picking me and Stephen up in the city on Saturday morning. He casually mentioned that he had tried calling Stephen too, but no one had answered. By Saturday morning, before he left Long Island, my father called me again to tell me that he still hadn't been able to reach Stephen. "I'm coming to get you first," he told me, "so we can go check on him together." My father was a brave and strong man who earned medals in World War II, but he feared the worst when he didn't hear from Stephen. He had been in this situation before. When I was very young, too young to remember, my grandfather developed throat cancer and had to have his larynx removed. But he refused to break old habits like chewing tobacco. He'd walk around his apartment on the Lower East Side with a wad of chew in his mouth while carrying a real glass spittoon, like something out of the Wild West. For years, my dad would drive into the city on weekends to pick up his parents and bring them out to our house for a weekly visit. But as my grandfather grew ill, he became too tired and uncomfortable to make the trip. He'd stay home while my grandmother came out. One Sunday afternoon, while dropping my grandma back at home, they realized they didn't have the key, but they couldn't get my grandfather to open the door. They banged, they rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. My father walked downstairs, walked up the fire escape, and climbed in through a window. His father was lying face down in the living room. There was blood everywhere. He had fallen. His glass spittoon had shattered, his neck had been cut, and he'd bled to death. This was one of those strange family secrets that I didn't know of until many years later. I always thought my grandfather had just died of cancer. We didn't know why Stephen wasn't answering his phone, but my dad didn't want to be alone when we found out. When we arrived at his building in Chelsea, I rang the buzzer downstairs, but there was no answer. We waited and then we tried it again, but there was still no answer. We stood there wondering what we should do when finally we heard Stephen yelling from his window, "I'm sick! I can't buzz you in!" My brother lived alone in an old building in Chelsea, and often the buzzer to let people in didn't work. When that happened, Stephen would put the front door key in a sock and toss the sock out the window. I yelled back to him, "Throw down the sock!" "I can't," he said. My only option was to climb up an old rusty fire escape to his fourth-floor window. I slowly pulled myself up with my dad eyeballing me from the street. As I reached Stephen's window, I stopped. There was Stephen, naked and curled up in a ball on his comforter in the middle of the living room. There was vomit all around him. He had been there for nearly 2 days, too weak to move or even to answer the phone. I threw down the sock with the key to my father, and he raced upstairs. We lifted Stephen and put him in the shower to clean him up, holding him the whole time. We took him to a diner to get some food in his system, but he threw up all over his plate. Then we rushed him into the car and, for some reason, decided to take him to a hospital in Long Island rather than in Manhattan. To this day, I don't know why we thought that was a good idea. The hospital didn't know what to do with him. Stephen was given fluids, and the doctors told us that he'd be more comfortable at home. That night, he slept in my old bed in the room we used to share. My mom became his nurse 24 hours a day. This was her greatest trait, mustering energy for tragedy. She had the strength of an ox. Stephen was incontinent, so she changed him. He was too weak to eat, so she fed him. A routine was established, and they existed in a kind of AIDS purgatory. He was too ill to take care of himself, but hadn't deteriorated to the point that being in a hospital was better than being at home. This went on for several weeks. Then I came home one weekend to visit and found Stephen looking especially bad. As he and I were talking, his eyes rolled back in his head. His body went limp. We panicked and called 911. A part of me was thinking, okay, this is it. This is where he's going to die. The ambulance arrived while he was still conscious, and my parents jumped into the back with the paramedics. As they raced off to the hospital with my brother, I was alone in the house. I walked out to the backyard and I began to cry. At that moment, believe it or not, the person I was mad at was Nancy. She had been a good friend after I found out Stephen was sick. She was a medical technologist who worked in hospitals. She had a cousin who died of AIDS. She understood how AIDS patients were treated and had seen how the disease progressed. We had just had a fight and stopped talking a few weeks before they took my brother away. Now I wanted to call her so badly and tell her what was happening. I was in the yard talking to myself. "I fucking need you for this, and you're fucking me over," I said, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out. What was there to say? I believed that was the last time I'd ever see my brother. Somehow Stephen survived that day. When he was admitted to Nassau County Medical Center, it was as though he had the plague. The building had a floor designated for people with AIDS, but he had been mistakenly taken to a different unit where no one wanted anything to do with him. The disease carried such a stigma. There was a great fear and ignorance about how it was spread. For a week, my mom railed against doctors, nurses, and administrators to have him transferred to the AIDS floor. God bless her for being so tenacious. As soon as Stephen was moved, his life got better. All of the attitude he'd been getting disappeared. The nurses on that floor were there because they wanted to be. They knew his life was going to end, and they treated him with dignity. When I went back to work that week, I sat down with Howard, Fred, and Robin individually and told them, my brother has AIDS. He's in very bad shape and was admitted to the hospital this weekend. That's when I realized no one yet knew my brother was gay. They all tried to figure out how Stephen had become sick without bluntly asking, is he gay? I sat with Robin for an especially long time. She told me she had a relative who was gay, and their biggest fear was getting this kind of news. I didn't say this to anyone, but I worried about how my situation might impact the show. We made gay jokes on the air all the time, and I didn't want the others to stop or feel uncomfortable because of me. It would have been patronizing. We received so many hate letters that began, I was always a fan of the show until you made fun of people with cancer because my sister had cancer and... My attitude was, if a bit was funny before it became personal, it should still be funny. But once everyone knew, the support was comforting. Shortly after I told Howard, he rushed into my office. He'd been reading a cover story in the Daily News about a guy who had just appeared on Joan Rivers' late-night talk show who claimed he had beaten AIDS. Howard said, we have to get a hold of this guy. Maybe he can help your brother. So he called Joan and asked her to make the introduction for us. Another day, Howard called a well-known local doctor with a show on public radio in New York. This guy had potions and powders and had preached healthy living. We spoke for more than half an hour about how to cure my brother of AIDS. The problem was nobody knew anything. The guy on the Joan Rivers show was full of shit. We never heard from him. The doctor's advice? Take massive doses of vitamin C to destroy the virus. All there was fear and ignorance. One afternoon I was on the subway coming home from work. The train was packed and I leaned against the pole. At this point, I always had reading material about AIDS with me. I pulled out a pamphlet, and as I read, I noticed a teenage girl leaning against the pole, too. She was dressed in a gray sweater and black skirt, typical New York Catholic school outfit. When I looked up, I realized half the train was filled with girls who went to this school. I didn't think about it, but after I put my head back down, I could see over the edge of the pamphlet that she was reading the other side of it. Her eyes moved back and forth quickly. Then she screamed, "He's got AIDS!" She was pointing at me. Everyone stopped and stared at me. What do I say? No, I don't? Inside the car, all activity seemed to come to a halt. I dropped my arms and let them hang at my side. A small circle of space cleared around me. A guy in a suit gave me the eye. A businesswoman, too. In a packed subway car, just for that second, it felt incredibly lonely. The people who understood the alienating effect the disease had were the ones who helped my brother the most. As much as medicine, he needed comfort. My mom was at the hospital every day from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. As the months went by,